said to his disciples, "In those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from the sky, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory, and then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the end of the earth to the end of the sky. Learn a lesson from the fig tree. When its branch becomes tender and sprouts leaves, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see these things happening, know that he is near at the gates. Amen, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father." Thus far the Gospel of Mark. So here we are getting into the eschatological Gospels and themes in the Gospels that are associated with the end of the year, the closing of the year. Jesus hearkening back to theophanies in the Old Testament and the image from the book of Daniel of the coming of the Son of Man. And it's a good opportunity to remind people or to explain to people the usefulness of gospel, or rather biblical commentaries. This particular one that I'm holding in my hand is from what's called the Navarre Bible. But even the Bible that you can download on your phone, the New American Bible, if you look at it for this passage, let's see here. There are about a half a page or more of notes at the bottom that help to explain what do these strange images in the gospel mean. In the Navarre Bible commentary, for the verses that come right before this, we're told that life is a testing time to prove our fidelity to God, and fidelity consists in acting on foot of this capital truth, that there is no Savior other than Jesus Christ. And then the passage for these verses, it would seem that the end of time, even irrational creatures will shrink before the supreme judge, Jesus Christ, coming in the majesty of his glory, thus fulfilling the prophecies of the Old Testament. When we hit passages like this, I think of the movie Independence Day.
Nice.
And if you've ever seen the movie Independence Day, when these giant alien spaceships show up at Earth, as they're coming down through the atmosphere, they drive before them clouds, so that if you're looking out over the horizon, you see these white clouds with fire in them rushing towards you. And behind them is one of these ships. But that image of the clouds and the fire and the lightning and the thunder, sometimes I've seen images of volcano lightning, an eruption that happens out of a volcano that throws up a huge ash cloud, and then lightning dances all through that ash cloud. That to me is another kind of a theophany, what I would imagine a theophany to look like. So Jesus is trying to impress upon his listeners using images from the Old Testament, that when God comes at the end of time, when the Messiah returns, it will be unlike anything they've ever seen. And how do you depict something that's unlike anything they've ever seen? Well, these are effective ways to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, it is something from a movie. Your reference to Independence Day is just great, just because that was probably one of my favorite movies back in the early 2000s,
Yeah.
late 90s. But yeah, it is like something from a movie, something so powerful that's, unimaginable, et cetera. When you read this, sometimes it can be sort of confusing because you're looking for this specific image of what's being described when there is a greater sort of viewpoint.
Well, and
it's look back.
It's not contradictory with, on the one hand, you might think, okay, why should people who God loves and who love God, why should they be terrified at his approach? Well, if let's say you're living in an area that's suffering from extreme drought, and suddenly you see breaking over the horizon a huge thunderstorm, you're so welcoming of the rain that's coming, yet you're going to be terrified of that thunderstorm because it comes with power and wind and lightning, and it comes with potential, and it's out of your control, and it's so much bigger than you that it's going to fill you with a certain sense of terror. So the mere fact that we that we love the Lord and we trust him to be faithful to his promises of saving us should not preclude that when we come to his presence, we might nonetheless be so struck with awe that we are sort of terrified.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, and also coming through, it's a good reflection too. I mean, living in Oklahoma, and we get a lot of powerful storms here. And I'm sure once again, there's a meteorologist who's an OU grad out there who's listening right now, telling us, you guys have no idea what you're talking about. But it just seems like this region, we get really powerful storms, and coming through a time of year when we had an extremely warm and dry September and October, now coming into November, we could use some rain. And so it's a good image. One piece that I wanted to just kind of mention is just this last line, because, some people will, you'll have some of these internet types or political commentators online, and different people will talk about, do you think the end times are here? Do you think they're coming? Do you think they're happening? But just these last two lines here but of that day or hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. I think that's interesting. And I think that there's, I think that that's sort of the thing that I think about when I read this, but I think it's interesting that it's nor the Son. The Son does not know. Only the Father knows. And obviously the Father and the Son are one, but
the purpose of the teaching is to warn them away from the natural human, which is why we have the preppers and all that, to warn them away from the natural human predilection to try to gauge when something's going to happen so that you're ready for it. And so, one of the ways that manifests itself is in people who are reticent to live the faith fully or to strive to form a real relationship with Jesus, figuring that they'll notice when they're close to the end time, either their own personal end time or the end times, and they'll do it then, a deathbed conversion. And Jesus wanting them to understand it may come upon you unawares. No one knows when it's coming. I don't even know when it's coming. And so you must be ready at all times. I was preaching about this at the Crozier Mass recently, that another way of seeing why we must be ready at all times, one way of seeing it is that fear that I don't want God to catch me not ready. I want to be ready in case I somehow suffer if I'm not ready. But the better way to see it, I think, is to recognize that God's love is coming to us all the time. At every moment, God is desiring to love us, is covering us with his love. And the more that we would live out of that, the more that we would get in touch with that reality, the more that we would let it become integral to our life and to the way that we conceive of ourselves and of other people, the more that we do that, the more that we will want to return that love all the time. And in the desire to return it and in striving to return it, we'll be living ready all the time. Loving God is being ready, and we will always be being ready.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. So in your recent column in the EOC, Bishop, in the October-November issue that hit homes in early October, you wrote a nice piece on discerning your vocation. And so just one of the pieces within that is this imagery of the farmer and the abundant harvest of abundant harvest to poignant discernment. Mm-hmm. And so just wanted to ask you about that and to share and share more ways, or in what way we're called to give ourselves in service and find our vocation.
Yeah, I think that one of the ways that we can misunderstand the subject of vocations and the word vocation is to immediately associate it with priesthood or religious life, those two vocations. And to forget that there is such a thing as a baptismal vocation, the call to love God, that everyone has. And even the way of understanding a vocation as a call from God in how I'm going to live my life, that God is inviting us. God knows better than we do even what will ultimately make us happy, what will ultimately give us a sense of cooperating with him in our life. And so everyone ought to discern their vocation, particularly when they're young people to discern their vocation. And I would say that every young person ought to discern whether or not they're called to priesthood or religious life. For most, that will take about 5 minutes. Because the point about discernment is that it's a way of prayerfully making a decision. And if you look at the life, if you get to know a little bit what the life of a priest is or what the life of a religious man or woman is, and you think about yourself living that life and you don't find anything in you that's really curious about that or attracted by it at all, then you're probably not called to it. So there, voila, there's your vocation discernment of those two vocations. Now, does that mean you're called to marriage? Not by default. You might be called to some kind of single life. If you are called to marriage, who and why? What is the purpose of your marriage? I think sometimes people think of marriage as kind of a default vocation. Sure. And if I'm not called to priesthood or religious life, well, then I'll just get married, without stopping to consider my marriage is also a vocation, a holy vocation, and it's intended to serve God, to serve the church. So what do I want to do with it? We want to get married for what reason? Not just because we're in love, not just because we love each other. That's not enough of a reason. There has to be some purpose. What is the vision for our marriage?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that, and we've talked about this a bit, whether on here or in private, but just about the difficulty of any vocation. sort of maybe, and when I say difficulty, I mean maybe sort of the human struggle or human difficulty. You know, I have let's call them human appetites, or I have, you know, a desire to sleep more when I have a baby who's crying, or when I have a parishioner who's dying and needs last rites as a priest, or when I may have to do the work that I am called in service to do. And so, do you think we are happiest when we pour ourselves out in service? And also, is it truly about being happy in our vocations?
Yeah, and you know, what do we mean by that? I was happy as a machinist. I enjoyed machine work before I went to the seminary. But as I considered the priest in my parish and the kind of work that he did and the life that he lived, and the possibility of doing that kind of work, of using my life that way, I hope people can hear me. My voice is choked up today.
I'm sure you're fine.
It seemed to me that life would be happier. It had a certain weight that felt different to me. Now, the reason it felt different to me, as I would later understand, is because I was being called to it. It wouldn't have felt that way if I wasn't being called to it. Or I would have understood over time that that's not what I was being called to. So all of us are made with a gift to give to others, the gift of ourself. John Paul II was the one who coined the term of the law of the gift, and that's what he meant, the law of the gift of self. And that law says that all of us are made to give ourselves away in love to others, and that we can't be truly happy, we can't be as happy as we're capable of, until we find how are we going to give ourselves away in love to others. And so the difficulty you bring up is a difficulty that's not related to one vocation or another vocation. That's what people mistakenly believe. When people think about celibate vocations, in the popular mind, celibate means I can't have sex. It means a lot more than that, but in the popular mind. And in the popular mind, I must have sex to be happy. So if I'm celibate and I'm not going to have sex, then I can't be happy. When you put those things together. But that's not what celibate means, and that's not what being happy means. A person who is celibate because they've been called by God to live this, to give themselves away in love in this fashion, that person is very happy. As a priest, I'm very, and now a bishop, I'm very happy. I wouldn't be as happy as I am had I gotten married, because that's not what I was being called to. Mm-hmm. I understand the beauty of marriage and the joy of it. I came from a family. I grew up in a family. I have 11 married siblings and nieces and nephews and all of it. But that's not what I'm called to. And so it would feel foreign to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or as a close priest friend of mine once said, I would look ridiculous driving a minivan. So what are some good tools for discernment? Or I think in this article, you actually sort of laid out like a few steps in the October EOC that we sent out. But what are some good tools?
Well, the three that we mentioned in the article, practical things, are practice of the faith, living the moral life, making a regular confession. If you put those three together, you see that they are a way of giving oneself away in love to God. I mean, those three are all contained in that. So a way to see what the image of those three altogether, if you toss a stone into a pond, it's going to stir the water up. There's going to be ripples and splashes, and you're not going to be able to see the bottom of the pond very well until the water settles and clears, and then you may be able to see every single piece of gravel in the bottom. Well, if you're not practicing your faith, if you're not striving to love Jesus and to live as a disciple of the Lord, then there's going to be something in you that is stirred up. And it's going to make it very hard for you to discern what God is calling you to. Similarly, if you're not living a moral life, this is why we say that chastity is sort of the, what should we say? Chastity is the wide road to discerning the married vocation. Because if you're in a relationship with the opposite sex, but you're not living a chaste life in that relationship, then you're creating all kinds of emotional bonds and all kinds of emotional drama before you're ready for it, because the level of the relationship doesn't equal what those things mean. When a man and a woman give themselves away in marriage, in the marital act, that's a permanent bonding that they're forming. It is a way of helping to strengthen the bond they have formed with their vows. Well, that bonding is going to happen even if they have sex outside of marriage. But the problem is the relationship that they're in is not one that should be bonded yet, because they don't know if they're supposed to be married to each other or at all yet. They haven't gotten married yet. And so if they're living an unchaste life, even worse, if they're living together, if they're cohabiting, now they're imitating marriage, which may give them the false sense that, well, this seems to be working, so let's get married. Except that marriage doesn't have a back door, and cohabitation by design has a back door. The couple who's cohabiting, in one way, is saying to each other, if this doesn't work, one of us can leave or both of us can leave. But the couple who gets married is saying, we foreclose that possibility anymore. We're in this together till death do us part. Mm-hmm. So the living of the moral life is necessary so that we can discern, are we in fact called to marry each other? And the making of the regular confession helps both of the other two. So it's a unintended byproduct of the practice that I guess it's at least in the United States. I don't know what other parts of the world it is. Mm-hmm. But the practice of having large parish-wide penance services at Advent and Lent, the unintended consequence of those large parish penance services is that people have come to think that I only need to go to confession once or twice a year. But do we sin once or twice a year? If you're like me, we sin more than once or twice a year.
Only once a year for me.
Yeah, I knew that.
It's usually on Thanksgiving when I eat too much.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I think it's interesting too. So to that point on confession, just to kind of speak about trends and stuff in the church. So a lot of, seems like a lot of schools across the country are trying to renew Catholic identity. It's sweeping the nation. You know, there's this renewal. And I think in many ways, schools, Catholic schools, over the years have gone through cycles. They go through these cycles where they realize we need to get back to our roots. We need to get back to why we're Catholic, to save the school. And oftentimes it's when they're in financial trouble. And then they get back to their roots and they get back to their teachings and why we educate a certain way. And we've seen this here locally with schools, and we've seen it on a national scale with schools. But it's interesting. I heard a chastity speaker recently speak to giving talks. This is a gentleman who's given something like 3,000 or 4,000 talks over the last 20 years in Catholic high schools around the country. And just speaking to different schools, there's schools where they have the large penance service during Advent and during Lent. And then there are schools that have confession times 3 times a day. Mm-hmm. Okay. And in the schools that have 2 penance services a year, they've got, 1,000 kids or 500 kids, and they've got maybe a few handfuls of kids involved in campus ministry.
Mm-hmm.
But in the schools where they have 3 confession times a day, they've got 600 of the 800 students in the school involved in campus ministry at the said high school.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just kind of fascinating to know. It's like, oh, well, is that causation or correlation? I mean, just it's interesting to think about that, because on one end it's like, oh yeah, I should go to confession, or oh yeah, we should have confession. But man, like when you start running some data on some of our schools, and you see that and you go, huh, it's pretty amazing the way that works. But I heard that story recently from this chastity speaker. I was fascinated by that.
Yeah, it makes sense, because we can, and it often does happen that someone who hasn't been to confession in a while begins to feel embarrassed about the fact that I haven't been to confession in a while. And they may even forget how to go to confession. And then they're embarrassed and afraid about, well, I can't go now because I don't even know what to do. What would I say? How do I do it? All the while, sin may be moving them away from God in very subtle ways that they're not seeing, they're not aware of. On the other hand, confession, which, by the way, you don't have to know how to do, and you can come anytime.
That's right.
The priest will not be amazed or surprised that you haven't been, or whatever it is. He'll help you make the confession. These days, there's an app on the phone for confession, and it will have all the prayers and everything's ready. But confession, making a regular confession, is a way of seeing yourself love the Lord. Not just saying, I love the Lord, but seeing yourself do something that a person who loves the Lord would do. And so it reinforces for you, no, me and Jesus, he is the center of my life. It is what I want to do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing to think about finding one's vocation through practice of the faith, living a moral life. I think it's challenging, though. I think that it's challenging. It's hard. It's hard to live the moral life. It's definitely the road less traveled. It feels that way at times. It feels that it's uphill at times.
I would say it this way, that it's hard to live life. And a person who is a grave sinner and a person who is striving to be a saint, both are going to get sick sometimes, both are going to experience loss and trauma, both are going to have good days and bad days. But the person who is striving to be a saint has a relationship with God that gives them grace to help them, both to help them literally, to help them physically even, but also to help them spiritually and emotionally, intellectually, to deal with the things that happen.
Times in my life when I have centered myself on my prayer, I've been intentional, disciplined about my prayer. We recently had a session on the intellectual life by one of our faculty here at the office, or one of our theologian in residence, I guess, Dr. Richard Malash. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because he was sharing that, it is the will that you are battling in the intellectual life. It is the will. Mm-hmm. And to me, as somebody who was former athlete and understands difficult, I was nodding along going, well, of course it is. Because it is hard to wake up early and get a good book and to read. It is hard to get up early and pray. Mm-hmm. It is difficult. But when I make that the center of my day, times in my life, seasons in my life where I've really prioritized that, mm-hmm. it's easier to not get in my own head. Mm-hmm. So I think what you're talking about, and when you talk about, confession, and when you talk about, sort of living the moral life and what makes it difficult, is oftentimes we're just in our own heads about stuff. And we get all stirred up about the wrong things mm-hmm. sometimes. And then we can't really figure out the right decisions on the big decisions. Mm-hmm. because we're not centered on the right things. And when I've been centered on that in my prayer life is the number one priority of my day, and I'm yearning for it. And I'm sitting there, and you get into this season, this sort of period of grace where you're going, I got to go to bed because I know tomorrow morning something's waiting for me when I wake up and have that first sip of coffee, and I'm ready to sit before the Lord. I think that those are the times when decisions are much easier, and we can get out of our own head, and we don't get trapped in that. I think that that's a struggle too. It's easy to justify not going or not doing the right thing, but yeah, it's a battle with the will for anything.
Well, I think too that people can think that discerning your vocation is always just in the head too. And, let's say you're a young man who's thinking a little about priesthood, but also about dating. Well, you can date, you can go out with a girl, but how do you try on priesthood? And if you don't do something to try on priesthood, then you're hampering your discernment, because then you are sort of in your head. But you could go on a retreat, you could go visit and talk to a priest, you could go to a seminary, you could go visit a monastery. There are ways to go and be around what priesthood is and what priesthood means, for example. The same thing in terms of dating. If you are thinking that, I think I'm going to be married, I think I'm called to marriage, but you date in the typical fashion of the culture that we're in, where it's kind of a promiscuous kind of dating, that's not what marriage is. Marriage is a holy state of life that requires sacrifice. I mean, you know it better than anyone as a father of many children. And so when you are dating and you are experiencing a desire to give yourself physically to someone, that's a moment to stop and say, yes, that's a good desire. And if I get married, it will be something holy in my marriage, but I'm not married. Therefore, it is something to sacrifice, and the sacrifice helps me to experience what marriage might be like. Being in a relationship, sacrificing something for the sake of the beloved and for the good of the relationship, and then seeing, how is that with me? How does that make me feel? It ought to make you feel good. It ought to make you feel like, yeah, that's a little bit hard. I'm really attracted to this person. Maybe I'm very tempted to be promiscuous with this person, but I love the way this feels, that I'm putting the good of the relationship and the good of this person ahead of what I want.
Yeah. Regardless of the vocation you choose, you're giving your life in service to the other.
Yeah. I used to say that, among college students, if a young man is asking a young girl out, a young woman out, and he can't tell her how he hopes the evening will go because she may be offended, then that's the sign to him that he's got the wrong vision. In other words, he shouldn't be going out with her and then trying to go as far physically with her as she will let him. He should already have formed in his mind, this is a young lady. I need to treat her like a young lady because I'm a young man. Therefore, no matter what happens, this evening is going to end with nothing more than maybe a kiss goodnight, and that's it. Not because she won't let me, but because that's as far as I'll go, because I respect this young woman. So it's that kind of an approach to dating that equals discernment, that can become a fruitful discernment for marriage, for example. And beyond that, you're stirring the water up in a way that's going to make everything hard to see.
Thank you.